The years close in 1854 descended with a biting chill upon Maryland's eastern shore. Within the county's ledges, the days were indistinguishable, a monotonous tally of dark ink columns, stacked figures, people's names, acres of land, and the number of available hands. No outward sign, it seemed, betrayed the nearing advent of Christmas. Yet, beyond their confines, the masters' abodes gleamed with festive lights, adorned with ribbons, their tables laden. The same calendar date, the selfsame chimes, bore vastly disparate meanings for all. For 4 years, a decree had hung heavy over the entire nation, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. It permitted a Southern master to pursue a fugitive into the free states, to lay claim to a body with naught but a signed document, demanding its return without the testimony of the accused, without the right of a jury. Official texts spoke of restoring order, of safeguarding legitimate property. Within the crude cabins by the marshlands, hushed whispers told of patrols, of hounds, of chains resurrected from a buried past. The law presented itself as a bulwark. For those who lived beneath its sway, it was a looming shadow, stretched taut over every step. Tucked within an archival cone, a fragile sheet, almost translucent from repeated handling, bore the date of December 1854. It encoded an ongoing inheritance, stipulating that certain assets were to be liquidated immediately following the holidays. The phrasing was unremarkable, a common formality that could refer to livestock, implements, furnishings, or even men and women. The official lexicon made no distinction, blending all into an indiscernible list. But beneath the euphemism of assets, entire families felt the ground crumble beneath their feet, for all understood the grim portent of a post-Christmas sale. The departing wagons, the shackled forms vanishing into the deep south, the very names one would no longer dare to utter aloud. It was amidst this tense atmosphere that a rumor began to weave its way through the communities, first in hushed tones, then in more precise fragments. On a plantation in the Poplar Neck region, 3 men stood on the precipice of sale: Ben, Henry, Robert. 3 brothers, 3 sons of a woman known as Rit, whose back had long since bent beneath the burden of countless harvests. Whispers claimed the sale was slated for just after Christmas, that the master or his creditors required liquid funds, and that these men, it was said, would fetch a good price. In the master's estimation, they were study subjects, seasoned labourers, hardened by the swamps. But in the hearts and on the lips of their loved ones, they were sons, husbands, brothers, poised to vanish forever. The archives yield no scenes of fervent dispute, no records of desperate gestures. They offer, at best, mere ciphers: the precise count of men of working age, the estimated monetary worth of each, calculated in dollars. They merely chronicle the abstract, the bloodless market value of a human form. Fear itself leaves scarcely a trace. One can only conjure its presence by reading between the lines, recalling that behind each stark figure lay a gaze averted, lest tears betray the soul. Far distant, in a northern city, a woman read or listened to these ominous rumors. Her name was now Harriet Tubman. In southern documents, her name still appeared, at times, as Araminta Ross, a wanted fugitive. A bounty was pledged for her delivery, complete with descriptions of her height, her gait, her scars. In the abolitionist gazettes of the North, however, she began to be heralded as a conductor on that clandestine route known as the Underground Railroad. 2 worlds, 2 legends, 2 starkly contrasting portraits of a single woman. To some, she represented a financial loss, a thief of property. To others, she became the living embodiment of silent defiance. Harriet now resided in Philadelphia and later journeyed throughout the North, toiling, saving, and regularly venturing back south to guide others to freedom. She had already tasted that invisible boundary line, separating legality from true justice. She knew precisely what the law purported should she be recaptured: the dungeon, the fetters, the auction block, perhaps even worse. But a persistent debt haunted her soul. In 1849, during her own escape, 2 of her brothers had turned back, paralyzed by the fear of abandoning those who relied upon them. She, alone, had passed onward to Pennsylvania. Since then, every Christmas, every census, every death inscribed in a Maryland ledger could signify for her the vanishing of a cherished face. When the rumor of a post-Christmas sale reached her, it was no mere abstract intelligence. It was a stark countdown. Against the polished facade of official documents auctioning asset realization, she cast a different interpretation. One did not merely liquidate assets. One tore sons from a mother, brothers from a sister. The official narrative, spun from state laws and gazette notices, portrayed the operation as a simple restructuring of estate. The lived reality, however, was that of a clock's relentless ticking, of a final Sunday gathered at table, of a gaze deliberately averted to avoid the tears within. In this prologue, the crux of the matter resided in this stark discrepancy. On one side, papers adorned with elegant signatures, impeccably placed ink, and red wax seals attesting to the legality of the deeds. On the other, calloused hands, tightly sealed lips, and whispers exchanged within the shelter of rough plank walls as the master's house blazed with festive lights. Proprietors spoke of generosity, of Christmas leave granted to slaves to visit their kin. The enslaved, however, perceived a brief aperture in a wall of constant vigilance, perhaps the last chance to vanish before being cast upon the auction block. Though the fading pages of archives, Christmas rarely made an appearance. One found dates, sums, names, rarely sentiments. Seldom a mention of snow, of biting cold, of carols sung. Yet, by cross-referencing these ledgers with testimonies gained years hence, one comprehended that for many of the enslaved, the festive season was not merely a period of slight respite. It was also the time of the master's gravest decisions, when estates, debts, and inheritances were restructured. Beneath the gallants and the psalms, lives were secretly dealt out like cards. It is into this void, this space where the archives fall silent on matters of true essence, that we lay open our account. We know that somewhere, in December 1854, a document declared a post-Christmas sale, chillingly listing 3 brothers as mere available chattels. We also know that concurrently, Harriet Tubman, in the North, apprehended this looming peril and began to chat, in the mind's eye, on maps, and within the memory of paths already traversed, the route that might pluck them from such a fate. Between the rustling of paper leaves and the footfalls in the night, an unseen bridge began to form. Thus begins our narrative. With a rumor of sale, with a calendar aligned to the Christian festival of Nativity, with a date that signified, depending on whether one read the Bible in a heated parlor or listened to the wind in a humble cabin, either hope or the abyss. Christmas 1854 would be, for some, an interlude of carols and gifts. For others, it would, by hook or by crook, become the night of escape before the auctioneer's hammer descended. In the dossier we have opened, the rumor of the post-Christmas sale commands the first page. But to truly grasp its meaning, one must turn back, rewind the years to a time when the name Harriet had yet to be born. In Maryland's registries, she first appeared under a different appellation, Arminta, often truncated to Minty. We find no detailed birth certificate, no document noting how, length, weight. As for freeborn children, we find at times amidst an inventory a girl, Minty, valued at approximately $5, lost within a list of swine, harnesses, and furnishings. The setting was the eastern shore of Maryland, Dorchester County, a land of marshes, forests, and rivers that emptied into Chesapeake Bay. In the cold light of legal texts, it was but one district among many, bound by the same statutes as the rest of the state. Slavery was legal, regulated, protected. Legislative acts delineated categories, prohibitions, penalties. They spoke not of the biting cold that seeped through the ill-fitted planks of the cabins, nor of the long nights spent listening to the wind, wondering if, come morning, someone would be missing. Arminta's parents bore the names Ben Ross and Rit Green. In the master's ledgers, they became Negro man Ben, Negro woman Rit, sometimes appended with an approximate age, a market value. Ben, a carpenter and woodsman, was hired out from plantation to plantation, his name traversing lease agreements like that of a specialized tool. Rit, bound more closely to a single household, saw her children enter the world under a simple, unyielding legal regime. Partus sequitur ventrem, the child follows the womb. What this signified, in terms of law, was starkly clear. Any child born to an enslaved woman was enslaved, regardless of the father, regardless of any bonds of affection. The paper decreed it in a few terse lines. Within Rit's body, it translated into pregnancies that yielded not merely sons and daughters, but, in the law's cold estimation, fresh property. In these early years, Arminta chose nothing, no did the archives. They decided what merited notation. The age at which she was sent to tend white children, to collect taps in the marshes, to watch over animals, remained unrecorded. The blows she endured when she fell asleep, exhausted, on a kitchen bench, did not appear in the registers. Yet, if a tool broke, if a harvest was meager, if a proprietor deemed the Negro girl he at least insufficiently productive, the trace of his complaint could be found. Violence, however, circulated in the shadows, without receipt, without record. We can trace, in filigree, Arminta's childhood through these documents that spoke not of her directly, yet concerned her intimately. Population censuses indicated the number of enslaved persons per household, categorized by sex and age bracket. In the column of girls under 10, an anonymous figure encompassed her. We know not what her face held at that age, the precise hue of her eyes, the timbre of her childish voice. We know only that, for the state of Maryland, she was an element in a ledger line, a factor in the calculation of wealth. At nightfall, however, within the cabins, another memory was forged. Kin later recounted that Minty was small but stout, obstinate, silent when struck. Her mother endeavored, as best she could, to keep her near, to shield her from the harshest things. But here again, law and custom prevailed. Ultimate authority belonged to the proprietor, not to the parents. A master could decide, with a stroke of a pen, to send the girl to neighbors, to lease her to another county. On paper, it was a rational management decision. In reality, it was an uprooting. A child torn from her siblings in the midst of a season. A late episode would scar her native like a central fissure. The head trauma Arminta sustained in a store when, still an adolescent, she was struck on the skull by a metal weight hurled by a foe aiming for another slave. The store's ledgers might mention, that day, the breakage of a few goods, the presence of customers. They say nothing of the blood, the confusion, the weeks of pain that followed. Biographies, relying on testimonies gathered many years late, would speak of fainting spells, visions, incessant headaches. The unofficial archives of the body, those read on skin and in nerves, were not encoded in the county registries. The tension between these two levels, the official written record and the lived reality, lies at the heart of this childhood. On the notary's pages, all seemed stable, ordered. Plantations changed hands, heirs divided lots. The value of subjects was estimated by age, strength, and skills. In Arminta's nights, something more unstable was at work. The sensation of an absolute injustice, the keen awareness of belonging to another by mere accident of birth. Witnesses would recount that, as a youth, she prayed to a higher power to break the master or mistress who caused her kin suffering, then caught herself, frightened by her own audacity. The Maryland landscape served as a constant stage for this childhood. The marshes where one could be lost, the forests where one learned to navigate by the sound of branches, by scents, the rivers whose tides betrayed the distant sea. None of this appeared in the laws. They knew only the straight lines of county borders, the property limits drawn on maps. But for a young girl who had to deliver taps before dawn, the night was already a school. She learned to move in darkness, to discern the silhouettes of trees, to recognize from afar the shape of a white house where she must not be seen. What was being prepared over these years held nothing spectacular in the eyes of the masters. For them, Minty remained a small, interchangeable figure within the group of young enslaved people. For us, upon re-examining the documents, another pattern emerges, that of a conscience taking shape, of a memory storing vital information. In the leasing registries, we see her move from one place to another. In her memory, these were roads being inscribed, landmarks, distances between two farms, two rivers, a hollow path where one could hide. Thus, to be born as property in Maryland in the first half of the 19th century was to be born on the margins of archives, at the edge of pages, in faceless numbers. It was to see one's existence fixed by the pen of others, by men who signed at the bottom of documents one would never read. But it was also, silently, to accumulate another kind of knowledge, an intimate lexicon of fear and courage, a keen sense of possible alliances and invisible dangers. In this contrast, between the cold ink of the registers and the warmth of enduring bodies, was forged the little girl who, one day, would take another name and decide to steal from this system what it claimed to possess, her own people. By 1849, the county's mortgage and probate records began to mention more frequently the name of the master who still owned Arminta. His health was failing, his debts mounting. In the neutral language of legal instruments, one read that it was expedient to realize certain assets, to proceed with the best possible disposition of the property. Nowhere was it explained that these assets breathed, spoke, had kin, and secret dreams. But in the cabins, everyone understood the grim implication. When death or bankruptcy threatened an owner, the bodies of the enslaved became the primary currency of exchange. For a young woman like Minty, who had grown up under this silent law, this period felt like a sky-gathering storm clouds. Witnesses would later say that she repeatedly told her loved ones she would never allow herself to be sold south. The word South did not merely designate a cardinal point. It evoked Louisiana, Mississippi, the cotton fields, where working conditions and punishments were reputed to be even harsher. There, one vanished. Letters, when they existed, did not return. Names dissolved. In the registers, conversely, the prospect of this sale was simple, a means to replenish an account, to settle debts. It was in this tension that, in 1849, the decision to flee germinated. Minty was no longer a child. Though repeated constraints, she had learned to read the signs of the times, the master's intentions, the probable trajectories of sale wagons. She knew she risked seeing her family broken, her brothers carried far away, herself resold. Maryland law recognized no right for her to refuse. On paper, consent did not exist. So she sought another space to exercise will, the night, the paths, the marshes. In this endeavor, two figures stood out. Brothers Ben and Henry. They too sensed the menace. Although the Federal Fugitive Slave Act had not yet been promulgated, local laws already provided severe penalties for fugitives and for anyone aiding them. Owners regularly complained in the press about property theft, which, in their view, slave escapes constituted. Newspaper advertisements promised rewards for anyone who would return a man, woman, or child in chains. These notices did not yet bear the name Harriet Tubman, but the mechanism was already in place. One day, the decision crystallized. The three siblings spoke in low voices, perhaps in a cabin, perhaps at the edge of a field, out of earshot of white overseers. Nothing of this conversation was recorded. No archive captured it. But its effects would appear. A few weeks later, a printed notice would report the flight of three persons: a man named Ben, another named Henry, a young woman called Minty or Araminta. The owner would detail their height, their demeanor, their probable destination. In the eyes of the law, for the duration of their absence, they would have become missing objects. On the chosen night, Minty put into practice all she had learned. The geography of Maryland, which she had traversed behind wagons, in the woods, delivering taps, became a mental map. To exit the plantation, avoid monitored roads, follow the edges of fields, skirt the marshes where footsteps left fewer traces. He brothers followed, torn between fear and hope. Behind them, they left parents, spouses, children. Before them, there was only the unknown, and, far off, the vague promise of a state where the law could no longer claim them as property. The archives, once again, say nothing of what transpired within their bodies that night. The cold sweat, the gasps, the pounding of their hearts when a dog barked in the distance, the way each turned, expecting to see a patrol lantern emerge. They give us only a number, an approximate date, sometimes a line in a journal. These slaves have absconded from the property of. This discrepancy is at once frustrating and revealing. It compels us to imagine, from the silences, the human density concealed behind these few words. As the hours passed, however, Ben and Henry's resolve fractured. They had immediate ties: a wife, young children, aging parents who relied on their labor for survival. In the logic of the slave system, this was one of power's chief weapons, chaining not only bodies but bonds, rendering any escape an act of guilty abandonment. For Minty, the calculation was different. She already carried in her mind the idea of returning for her kin once free. She could no longer bear the thought of being sold like an animal. A rift began to form, not only with the masters, but within the sibling group itself. Late accounts would evoke a tense scene. The brothers, panicked, insisted on turning back, terrified that their flight would end in the gallows or the lash, and their loved ones punished in their stead. Minty, for her part, pleaded, argued, invoked the promise of another future. But in this confrontation, fear prevailed. The law, so distant and abstract in its texts, weighed with its full force upon their imaginations. They already saw the chains, the dogs, the blows, bodies scarred for life. They chose to return to the known enclosure rather than continue toward an unknown that might be fatal. In the proprietors' registries, this episode might not appear, perhaps only by the mention of an attempted escape, followed by a note indicating that two of the subjects had returned of their own accord, repentant or frightened. The official narrative cast itself in a favorable light, suggesting that the enslaved recognized their owner and wisely returned to their place. Nothing was said of the threats, the supplications, the sleepless nights that preceded this return. No was anything said of the one who, soon, would never return. For from this first aborted attempt, Minty drew a radical conclusion. If she waited for everyone to be ready, for fear to recede on its own, she would be sold, carried away, broken. In the discretion that always surrounds the important decisions of the oppressed, she chose to leave again, this time alone. This second departure left very few written traces. A few mentions in runaway notices, a span of dates in biographical reconstructions. But for her, it marked a definitive break. Once she crossed the Pennsylvania border, she would no longer be, legally, the same. When she finally arrived in free territory, after days of walking, makeshift shelters, and clandestine delays, the contrast was so profound that the phrases attributed to her in testimonies seemed almost too simple. She was said to have looked at her hands, wondering if they were truly those of a free woman. Hello, I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. She had saved her life, but to do so, she had had to leave them behind. Later, when she would be known as Harriet Tubman and return, Christmas 1854, to seek Ben, Henry, and Robert, this first, incomplete and painful escape would cast a shadow over every step. Between the lines of the documents, what we discern of 1849 is thus less a triumphant escape than a series of decisions wrenched from the brink of the abyss. The law, the wanted notices, the county registers recounted a theft of property. Harriet's body and memory recounted another story, that of a woman who, having once crossed the line, now refused to forget it, and was already preparing, in the silence of the North, to open the dossier that, a few years later, would bear the notation of Christmas 1854. When Minty finally crossed the border, separating Maryland from Pennsylvania for good, she did not suddenly become another person. Southern registers continued, for some time, to bear her name as that of a wanted fugitive. Runaway notices described her as Minty, also called Araminta, with details of her height, the shape of her face, perhaps the scar left by the metal blow received in adolescence. On the other side of the line, however, she began to slide towards another name, another status, another dossier. It was in this legal and identity-based in-between that Harriet Tubman gradually emerged. The choice of this name was not recorded by an official act. It is not found in the registers of a northern court, nor in the columns of a newspaper. It is reconstructed from fragments. Harriet was the given name of her mother, Rit, sometimes called Harriet, in white people's documents. Tubman was the surname of her husband, John Tubman, a free black man from Maryland, whom she married some years before her escape. By joining these two elements, she fashioned an identity that bore the traces of her strongest bonds, her mother, her marriage, her family life. Legally, this changed nothing of her status in the eyes of Maryland. She remained an enslaved fugitive. But for her, this new name was a discreet act of self-possession. In Philadelphia, freedom was far from absolute. Pennsylvania laws prohibited slavery, but networks of informants and slave catchers were already active. In free black parishes, at abolitionist meetings, names of traitors were whispered, cases of captured fugitives returned south were discussed. Reports from anti-slavery societies of the late 1840s and early 1850s increasingly mentioned cases of individuals abducted from northern streets, sometimes even free blacks whom Southern masters claimed to recognize. The line between slavery and freedom, on paper, was clear. In practice, it was dangerously porous. Harriet found work, like many female fugitive black women, domestic servant, cook, laundress. Her earnings were modest, but every coin saved represented a form of moral capital, enough to pay a messenger, a letter, a delay for someone else. In abolitionist archives, she appears not as an isolated heroine, but as an integral part of a fabric of women and men who, in the kitchens, cellars, and attics of northern cities, organized a discreet resistance to the law. Minutes of meetings mention the names of William Still, Thomas Garrett, pastors, anonymous Quakers. Harriet is not always cited, but later accounts assemble these fragments and show her seated in these assemblies, silent, attentive. In 1850, a new element weighed the scales, the Fugitive Slave Act, voted by the United States Congress as part of a broader political compromise. This text brutally tightened the rules for hunting fugitives. Henceforth, every northern office was legally bound to assist in the arrest of persons suspected of having fled slavery. Fugitives' testimonies held virtually no value before the federal commissioners charged with these cases. A simple affidavit from a master or his representative was often sufficient to have a man, woman, or child returned south. Judicial archives in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, filled with dossiers that repeatedly contained the same formula, delivered to the claimant. For Harriet, this meant that the freedom she believed she had attained was now but a grey zone. Even in Philadelphia, she could be identified, arrested, returned. She quickly understood that the safe haven shifted further north, towards British Canada, where slavery was abolished and where American authorities could not legally claim her. In correspondence among abolitionists, new priorities emerged, no longer merely guiding fugitives to the free states, but to the Canadian border and then beyond. The very vocabulary transformed. There was talk of passengers who needed to cross the line, of stations and conductors. It was in this context that Harriet Tubman, in turn, became a conductor on that clandestine path known as the Underground Railroad. Here again, official archives remained sparse. They preferred to preserve the complaints of owners who denounced organized bands of slave stealers and demanded compensation for the loss of their property. In these documents, Harriet appeared, when she appeared at all, as a criminal, a woman who abducted slaves, who incited to flight. The language was revealing. What she called saving, the law called stealing. Abolitionist sources offered another perspective. William Still, secretary of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, kept a journal where he noted the arrival of fugitives, their first names, sometimes details of their journeys. This register would later be one of the few places where the words of those who had fled slavery were transcribed with a minimum of attention to their own versions. It mentions a small, energetic woman from Maryland who returned regularly, accompanied by groups, and refused to be photographed or to give too many details for fear of epistle. This implicit portrait was that of Harriet. With each journey south, she consciously violated the letter of the Fugitive Slave Act. Legally, she placed herself back under the authority of her former masters, who could have had her arrested at any moment. Psychologically, each time she moved further away from the role society had assigned her, her own accounts, gathered much later, would emphasize her absolute trust in God, the visions and intuitions that guided her. The narrative that we might see in this, in light of her head trauma, manifestations of chronic physical suffering. But whatever the interpretation, one fact remains. She moved forward in a world where human laws were radically hostile to her, relying on another type of certainty. Harriet's returns to Maryland left only broken traces in the archives. Here, a wanted notice increased the reward amount, describing her as extremely dangerous to property. There, an owner complained in a letter that this woman has already taken several of our best subjects. In sales registers, some names disappeared, not because they had been bought, but because they had vanished from the column, replaced by a dash, an abbreviation, a whispered comment between two lines. This void is the imprint of her passages. With each group she accompanied, Harriet re-experienced the tension already felt in 1849. To leave was to save someone, but it was also to leave others behind. She saw mothers hesitate between fleeing with one child and abandoning another, men refusing to leave without their wives, young girls retracting at the last minute, thinking of the blows that would fall upon those who remained. These decisions do not appear in any judicial record. They are dead, late, in fragments of natives collected in hushed tones, in old age, by activists or historians. Over these years, a reputation was built. In the plantations, her name circulated as both a threat and a promise. Masters described her as a witch, a devil, seeking to explain by superstition what they dared not acknowledge. The intelligence, patience, and strategic experience of an illiterate black woman who repeatedly outwitted their system. In black communities, free or enslaved, she became, on the contrary, a symbol of possibility, living proof that captivity was not an absolute fate. Around 1854, when our account returns to the rumor of sale threatening Ben, Henry, and Robert, Harriet was no longer merely the fame Minty who had fled alone. She was now a seasoned conductor who had learned to read maps, to negotiate with delays, to discern times when patrols were fewer, to detect, in the columns of a southern newspaper, the signs announcing an upcoming sale. The pieces we have spread upon the table wanted notices, extracts from abolitionist journals, letters from furious owners, incomplete lists of fugitives who arrived in the North, compose the portrait of a woman who transformed her own uprooting into a method. It is this accumulated experience, silent, indeed invisible in most grand historical syntheses, that would make the Christmas 1854 operation possible. When she learned that her brothers were to be sold after the holidays, she would not be a powerless sister reading a distant sale notice, but a conductor who knew that, in the interstices of law and calendar, a night of opportunity existed. The remainder of our account will show how this night would take the form of a coded letter entrusted to a free man, and a discreet rendezvous in the heat of the cold. In the dossier we leaf through, one piece is missing. We do not possess the letter itself. No archive box, neither in Philadelphia nor in Maryland, preserves that rectangle of paper which one day in December 1854 travelled from the north to the eastern shore. Yet, several testimonies converge. Harriet Tubman is said to have sent a coded message to a free black man, Jacob Jackson, a veterinarian, to warn her brothers of the danger threatening them and to set the time for their escape. It is therefore from secondary traces, reported phrases, marginal mentions, that we attempt to reconstruct this vanished piece of correspondence. Jacob Jackson appears in official sources at the periphery of white scrutiny. In some county registers, he is designated as a free Negro, owner of some property, working as a veterinarian or animal caretaker. His profession, in a region of plantations and farms, gave him access to various properties. Masters needed him for their horses, their oxen, their dogs. They tolerated his peasants, sometimes even expected it, while still considering him socially in feo. Mainland law limited his rights, monitored his movements, but nonetheless recognized his legal freedom. This fragile freedom made him a valuable link in any clandestine chain. Harriet, fo he pat, knew she could not simply wait. Flee. I am coming for you. The Fugitive Slave Act, indeed any correspondence suspect. A let addressed directly to enslaved individuals would be easily incepted, opened, eddy, by a master or post office employee. It risked not only betraying the plan, but also leading to the arrest of anyone suspected of complicity. Writing, in this context, was not a mere means of communication. It was a dangerous tool, monitored, potentially deadly foe those who misused it in the eyes of the established ode. Late collected testimonies therefore evoke a let that seemed unamicable, perhaps addressed to Jacob Jackson on an apparently banal subject, health news, a equest foe animal K, a seasonal jeting during this Christmas period, a let that a white eye could scan without seeing anything other than cordial correspondence between North and South. But at the end, in a phase that seemed pious and innocuous, the message was hidden. When the good ship of Zion comes along, be easy to step aboard. To an uninitiated Eid, this was a biblical allusion, fashionable in religious sermons, faux Harriet's baths. It was a precise ode. When the opportunity os, do not miss it. Everything he ested on a chain of trust. Fist, the let had to reach Jacob Jackson. Postal archives do not provide details of this journey. They only indicate that in 1854, the service operated with relative regularity between Philadelphia and mainland towns, that mailbags passed, though relays, stations, stagecoaches. Each stage was an opportunity for loss, theft, indeceit opening. Then Jacob, once the letter was in hand, had to understand the code, interpret it as Harriet intended, and find a way to transmit the message to Ben, Henny, and Robert without attracting the master's attention. Judicial documents yield no record of a trial against Jacob Jackson for complicity in escape. Newspapers hostile to abolition do not mention his name. This silence can be explained in several ways: extreme prudence on his part, luck, disorganization of authorities, or simple contempt for a free black man deemed secondary. Whatever the case, the absence of prosecution does not ease the danger he faced. Every word spoken to the brothers, every gesture to meet them discreetly, could have, if discovered, transformed into proof of his sedition. The official version of the law was clear. Helping a fugitive was participating in a theft. Jacob's lived reality, however, was that of a man risking his fragile freedom to transmit a coded phrase. What is striking, upon rereading the works of historians focusing on this episode, is the modesty of the material means and the magnitude of the stakes. On one side, a simple letter, a few lines written in ink, perhaps on cheap paper, without ostentatious seal, entrusted to anonymous hands. On the other, the fate of 3 men about to be put up for auction a few days after Christmas. The contrast with other pieces in our dossier is striking. To prepare this sale, masters gathered notaries, appraised the market value of bodies, filled out forms, scheduled a calendar, exchanged official correspondence. To oppose it, Harriet and Jacob had only a discreet fragment of paper and whispered words. We must also pause on the question of writing itself. Harriet Tubman, according to current research, could neither read nor write. The letter she sent was therefore probably drafted by someone else, at her request, an abolitionist, a church member, a literate, free black woman. The archives do not tell us who this scribe was. He or she disappears, like so many hidden actors, behind the more visible figure of Harriet. But this mediation again underscores the discrepancy between the world of official ink, mastered by whites, and the subverted uses of writing by those to whom it was denied. At this stage of the native, the tension is not yet that of physical flight, of footsteps in the snow. It is a tension of paper, ink, and silence. In Philadelphia, somewhere in an office of a back room, Harriet dictated or suggested that phrase about the ship of Zion that would serve as a password. The pen scratched the paper, tracing signs that the law recognized as meaningful. Then the fold was closed, the address written, the stamp affixed, the letter entrusted to the impersonal flow of mail. At each step, a white employee's hand took it, sorted it, slipped it into a bag, unaware that it carried an invisible threat to the slaveholding order. In the Eastern Shore, the inverse scene played out. Jacob Jackson received the folded letter, unsealed it, read. We do not know if he smiled upon reading the coded phrase, if he prayed, if he looked around to ensure no one was watching him. The archives retain nothing of his emotions, but we know, from the sequence of events, that he understood. It then remained for him to play his role as a relay, await the opportune moment, cross paths with the brothers, under some pretext, a horse to tend, a sick dog, a chance encounter on the plantation road, and repeat the phrase, with the tone and insistence necessary for them to perceive the urgency. In this chain, each human link confronted a form of potential violence. Harriet risked capture and resale if his involvement was exposed. Jacob risked imprisonment, a fine, or even expulsion from Maryland. The brothers risked blows, shackles, accelerated sale if they showed the slightest sign of preparing to flee. The law spared no space for compassion or family loyalty. It recognized only the rights of owners to reclaim what they considered their due. It is precisely against this worldview that the mere letter, with its subverted biblical phrase, stood. At first glance, this story of a coded letter might almost seem romanticized, too perfect, tailored to fuel a heroic narrative. But it is part of a long tradition of messages circulating in the form of songs, plays, subverted verses, formulas that, for some, were merely religious cliches, and for others, precise instructions. Official archives, saturated with legal and commercial prose, do not know how to capture these subterranean circulations. They retain traces of them only when they fail and are brought before a court. Here, precisely, the judicial silence around Jacob tends to confirm that the use worked. By reconstructing, piece by piece, this episode, we see how, on the eve of Christmas 1854, the struggle against the announced sale did not begin with footsteps in the snow, but with a pen on a sheet of paper. The battle was first fought on the terrain of language, subverting religious vocabulary, used every Sunday to admonish slaves to obedience, to announce, on the contrary, a radical disobedience, exploiting the postal circuits of the nation that legally guaranteed slavery, to prepare a breach in that very system. On the horizon, behind the phrase "Ship of Zion," another image already emerged, that of a night when it would indeed be necessary to hastily embark, before the masters closed, upon the boats, the icy hold of a post-Christmas sail. On the table, beside the vanished letter, another type of document, far more commonplace, far more frequent, must be placed: the sale advertisements. In Maryland, newspapers of late 1854, amidst columns recounting political news, market prices, local accidents, one found these regular, almost mechanical inserts: public sale, after the holidays, auction of entire property, lands, livestock, slaves. The language was polite, codified, devoid of roughness. It announced what, for the owners, was merely normal management during the year-end period. The calendar was not chosen by chance. For a long time, in the slave-holding South, the holiday season was a privileged moment to reorganize estates. Masters then had more time, agricultural activities slowed, markets were more easily held. Above all, it was a period of talk of gifts, generosity, and balance sheets. To settle debts, to resolve a succession, sales were planned just after Christmas. In judicial and notarial archives, this expression reappeared often as a matter of course. It shocked no one among those who drafted it. It linked the circulation of bodies to the accounting logic of a Christian calendar. In the case of Harriet's brothers, the scenario followed this pattern. A master, or perhaps several co-heirs, found themselves in financial difficulty. Lands were mortgaged, creditors passed. On the papers, figures aligned, amounts due, deadlines, estimated values. Among the solutions envisioned, the sale of a few adult enslaved heads appeared as the primary option. Those who, by their age and strength, could yield the most were chosen. Men in their 30s, accustomed to marshland labor, reputed to be resilient. Ben, Henry, Robert found themselves inscribed on this list, not as persons, but as units of value. The law precisely framed these operations. It required public announcements, posted at the county courthouse or published in a local newspaper, for the sale to be deemed regular. It set deadlines, payment terms, creditors, rights. It said nothing, however, of the need to inform the interested parties themselves. The enslaved often learned their destiny by rumor, by snippets, by overhearing fragments of conversation among whites. In the case of this Christmas 1854, it was likely thus that the news descended from the offices to the cabins. A phrase overheard, a sigh from an overseer, an allusion to those who will depart after the holidays. For the owners, the Christmas celebration was not called into question by these preparations. Meals were organized. Perhaps a small distribution of clothing or food to the enslaved was planned to demonstrate a certain benevolence. On the masters' tables, passages from the Gospel speaking of peace, birth, and light were read. In sermons, some pastors exhorted the enslaved to patience, to obedience, promising them a reward in the other world. The same Bible that served as a reference for legitimizing the slave order was the one from which Harriet would subvert a verse to announce escape. On the side of the cabins, the perception of this calendar was entirely different. Christmas, for enslaved families, could be one of the few times of the year when one obtained relative leave, an exceptional visiting permission. Masters liked to present themselves as generous, magnanimous. They granted passes to allow certain enslaved individuals to go to another plantation to see parents and relatives. These papers, hastily drafted, signed by a white hand, became, for a few hours or a few days, precious shields against patrols. It was precisely on this brief beach that Haiti would rely. If he bothered obtained permission to leave, for Christmas, the plantation where they were employed, and to go to where their mother still lived, then a space opened up, one where they would not be under the direct surveillance of a foreman, where they could, in theory, disappear without it being immediately known whether they had fled or had simply been delayed on the road. The same custom which for the masters was a gesture of festive condescension could, for those calculating escape, serve as a mask for a disappearance. Before reaching that point, however, one must gauge the pressure this sales calendar exerted on minds. Haiti, from the north, could access through newspapers, letters, messages, indications of planned sales in his native region. Abolitionist newspapers sometimes reproduced, while denouncing them, advertisements for slave sales published in the southern press. For him, these columns were not abstractions. Each mention of a Negro man of a certain age on such and such a plantation on the eastern shore could echo a face, a first name. To the coldness of the announcement, she opposed the warmth of a memory. In both free and enslaved black communities, the approach of Christmas was thus marked by a dual emotion: the prospect of a respite, a visit, a slightly better meal, and the fear that it might be the last Christmas spent together. Women counted the days until the announced auction, not daring to speak of it too loudly. Men observed their masters' slightest gestures, looking for signs of an imminent change, a stranger coming to inspect the fields, more frequent discussions with a lawyer, documents being signed. The body, accustomed to years of surveillance, became a barometer of these invisible fluctuations. What the official version would never say is how this deadline gnawed at their nights. In the registers, the sale would be recorded in a few lines: date, location, names of buyers, prices realized. Nothing would indicate that, in the preceding days, some had ceased to sleep, that mothers had held their children longer than usual, as if to engrave their warmth in their memory. Nothing would indicate either the stifled dialogues where, for the 100th time, the impossible question had been considered: is it better to flee at the risk of losing everything, or to stay at the risk of being sent even further? By analyzing these documents, by arranging them side by side, one clearly discerns two temporalities that overlap without ever meeting. The time of the law, regulated, administrative, chaining the stages, announcement, delay, auction, transfer of property, and the time of fear, irregular, made of long nights, stretched days, minutes where one held one's breath. At Christmas 1854, these two temporalities intersected at a single point: a date inscribed in a sale notice, and a night during which it would be necessary to decide whether to wait for the hammer to fall or to attempt to disappear before it did. In this chapter of the dossier, the slave market appears not as an exceptional event, but as the logical consequence of a system that, for generations, treated human beings as mobile values. What is exceptional, what will break, is the decision of a few to refuse to be lined up in the column of realized assets. For now, however, from the point of view of the papers, nothing has yet changed. Newspaper inserts are printed. Notaries await the end of the holidays. Masters prepare to raise their glasses. Snow falls, or winter rain, on paths where nothing yet indicates that they will become, in a few nights, routes of escape. As we close this section of the dossier, we are struck by a chilling irony. The same day that celebrates, in the Christian calendar, the the birth of a child in a stable is used, in account books, as a neutral landmark to prepare the tearing of children and brothers from their families. To this contradiction, no decree, no homily responds. It is in the silence of the cabins, in decisions made in hushed tones, that an answer is sought. For Harriet, it would take the form of a precise plan, a calculated appointment with time, to use the relative permissiveness of Christmas to outwit the rigidity of the sale. Christmas night would no longer be merely a date in a notice. It would become, for her brothers, the narrow footbridge separating the column of sold property from the fragile line of fugitives. In the Maryland registers, the date of December 24th, 1854, bears no special mark. On the preserved pages, one barely reads a few ordinary transactions, a delayed payment, a mention of court closure for the holidays, sometimes a note of leave granted to certain enslaved individuals to visit their families. Nowhere is it written, night of escape, conspiracy, rendezvous. Yet it is on this precise date that, in the Poplar Neck region, several trajectories would cross in the shadows. The arrangement for the masters was simple. At Christmas, certain enslaved individuals were granted a pass to visit their relatives on another plantation or in another county. This document, handwritten, indicated the person's name, destination, and the tolerated duration of absence. It was presented to the white patrols who monitored the roads and paths. On paper, it attested to the owner's goodness and trust. In reality, it primarily served as a reminder that the body carrying it remained under control. Beyond the indicated date, absence became flight again, punishable by blows, chains, or even accelerated sale. It was to this type of permission that Ben, Henry, and Robert could lay claim for Christmas 1854. They worked on lands near where their mother, Rit, still lived. Masters knew that allowing enslaved people to see their loved ones at this season eased tensions, reinforced the image of a generous authority. No one was unaware that a separated family remained calm if, from time to time, these brief reunions were conceded. A Christmas pass cost nothing to the one who signed it. It could yield much in apparent loyalty. What the owners did not see, or chose not to see, was that this small opening in the wall could be used for something other than supervised embraces. We do not know the exact hour Harriet arrived in the vicinity. The archives do not record her footsteps. They say nothing of the cabin where she might have hidden, awaiting the appointed moment. But considering her experience, her previous journeys, one can imagine that she reached the region before the critical date, using known paths and safe delays. She appears in no inn register, no post office book. Her presence was, in the eyes of the administration, non-existent. Yet it was she who, that night, gave new meaning to the few ink strokes traced on her brother's passes. Around the house where Rit, their mother, still lived, the Christmas atmosphere was heavy. The masters may have distributed a little more food, permitted the slaughter of a hog, offered some cheap fabrics. The cabins resonated with songs, prayers, forced laughter. Behind these gestures, everyone felt the looming threat. After the holidays, some of these faces might no longer be there. The probate files, which the enslaved never saw, already bore the weight of these future absences. The notary's columns were filled. The void was being prepared. When the two brothers arrived, bearing their written permissions, their mother's joy was mixed with silent anguish. She embraced her sons. She thanked God aloud, as custom dictated, but her hands trembled. She knew, in a way that bypassed documents, what this visit signified, perhaps the last before the sale. At this precise moment, Harriet was still, for her, only a painful memory, that of a daughter who had fled, who had survived, but who had left behind a void. The masters, when they wished to humiliate Ruth, might have evoked this flight, presenting it as a betrayal. In the records, the daughter's name was accompanied by a word: absconded, disappeared. The meeting between Harriet and her brothers, between Harriet and her mother, is not found in any official report. No clerk took the trouble to note the exact location, the words exchanged, the gestures. This archival silence compels us to remain on the edge of the scene, to view it with appropriate restraint. We know only that at some point, during these hours of leave, Harriet managed to approach her kin under cover of night or a casual visit. Perhaps she presented herself as a neighbor, veiled in a headscarf, taking advantage of the cabin's obscurity. Perhaps she waited until the master's house was plunged in slumber, to slip between two plank walls. What transpired then was not merely the joy of reunion, it was a negotiation, a moral debate, a resumption of the 1849 conflict. Must they leave this time? Must they finally cross the point of no return? The brothers were no longer the same as they had been. The prospect of sale pressed upon them. They had seen in recent months other men chained, taken south, disappeared. The calendar weighed heavily. It was no longer a vague threat, but a dated deadline. Harriet, strengthened by her journeys, could offer them something other than an absolute unknown. She now knew escape routes, names of trustworthy people, paths that had already been used. Yet the obstacle had not vanished. Ben, Henny, Robert were not only sons and brothers. Some were also husbands, fathers. Behind them, wives, young children, elderly dependents whom they supported with their labor. To leave was to escape sale, but it was also to abandon them to the master's wrath, to espials, to want. Maryland laws ignored these dilemmas. For the state, only two categories existed: slaves in place and fugitive slaves. Between the two, all nuance disappeared. In reality, this Christmas night was permeated by tragic nuances. One can imagine Harriet's arguments without putting them into dialogue. The imminence of the threat, the certainty that if they did not leave now, the sale would send them so far that all chance of reunification would vanish. She understood the mechanics of the slave market. She knew that, sold after Christmas, they could find themselves in Georgia, in Louisiana, in a world where even the knowledge of the routes would no longer suffice. She could promise them, without guarantee, the possibility of a late regrouping, as she had done for others. But she could not ease what hurt the most, the thought of looking, one last time, at those they could not take with them. The archives, once again, recorded only the result. In the lists of fugitives, one finds the trace of 3 men who left Poplar Neck in late 1854. In abolitionist memoirs, the tale of a successful operation where Harriet snatched her brothers from sale recurs as a motif. Between these two poles, the cold column and the admiring homage, lies the human substance of the night, the hesitation, the restrained tears, the hands clasped too tightly at the moment of parting. None of this is dated, signed, authenticated. And yet, this is where the heaviest part was played. The Christmas permission, that narrow corridor, thus formed the framework of the operation. At an agreed moment, when the master's house was occupied by supper, carols, alcohol, when lanterns extinguished one after another, the meeting between the brothers and Harriet transformed into departure. The passes, which were meant to bring them back to their workplace the next day or the day after, ceased to be a simple administrative document. They became, for a few more hours, a screen that blurred the tracks. As long as the dates they bore were not exceeded, their absence could be explained. Past that deadline, they would, in the eyes of the law, fall into the category of fugitives. Harriet knew she had only one night's head start. In this chapter, Christmas night is therefore not a sentimental setting, but a legal and psychological nexus. It is the moment when, for the last time, the brothers could embrace their mother within a framework tolerated by the masters, while secretly preparing an invisible uptake. It is also the moment when Harriet, attuned to the territory that still claimed her as property, agreed to stake her freedom to settle the debt of 1849. By leading her brothers to freedom, she responded to the fracture that had opened then, when, on another nocturnal path, they had chosen to turn back. In the sales records, after Christmas 1854, a void would appear. Where 3 names were expected, one would perhaps find a furious note, a scratch, an unavailable. The masters would complain, write indignant letters to neighbors, perhaps publish a notice promising a reward for their capture. The official version would record that the 3 slaves had taken advantage of Christmas permission to escape. It would not say that they had also taken advantage, that night, of a presence that the registers could not capture, that of a woman who, under an assumed name, made the very calendar of slavery the instrument of their evasion. The hours following the departure bear no name in the Maryland records. For the clerks, the night of December 24 to 25, 1854, would later be summed up as a single observation: the 3 men had not returned from their leave. In the newspaper columns, it would take a few days for a notice reporting their disappearance to be printed. Between these 2 moments, the noticed absence and the public announcement, stretched a time that belonged only to those who walked. Harriet had learned, through her previous journeys, that the first danger always lay nearby. As long as the fugitives remained within the usual range of patrols, as long as their silhouettes could be recognized by a neighbor, an overseer, a slave catcher, capture was a mere matter of chance. It was not, therefore, that night, about rushing to a distant body, but first about dissolving into the night, escaping the familiar gaze that could, with a word, return them to the column of missing property. The night was cold. Whether there was snow or rain, frost or mist, mattered little. What mattered was that darkness covered the paths, that sounds carried far, that every broken branch could betray a passage. Ben, Henry, Robert had worked all the previous day, then travelled to each their mother's plantation. Fatigue already weighed on their shoulders, yet they now had to bear it like an extra garment, without succumbing. Behind them, with each step, superimposed the image of the preceding cabins, of sleeping or awakened faces that did not yet know that this might be the last night shared. Harriet, who had made this journey so many times, imposed a rhythm unknown to the archives, neither too fast to exhaust those she guided, nor too slow to risk encountering a patrol. She knew where the dogs passed, where the roads were more heavily guarded, where the marshes offered, despite their dangers, a screen against pursuers. Official county maps drew straight lines for roads, curves for rivers. In her memory, the territory was made of embankments, ditches, thickets, old stumps she recognized by touch. Above their heads, the law did not sleep. Since 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act had given slave catchers almost unlimited power. Even if the brothers managed to escape Maryland, even if they reached Delaware, then Pennsylvania, they would remain, in the eyes of the federal government, unreturned property, which every citizen was supposed to help restore. In court records, this law appeared as a structured, numbered, argued text. It was the product of debates, political compromises, solemn signatures. In the heavy footsteps of Ben, Henry, Robert, it manifested in another form, the conviction that no place in this country could fully consider them free men. The contrast between these 2 levels, the majestic language of laws and the reality of 4 silhouettes moving through undergrowth, lay at the heart of this night. If one were to open a county file at the exact moment they crossed a frozen ditch, one might find a deed of land purchase, a judgment for a boundary dispute, but nothing about the mud clinging to their feet, about Harriet's hands striving to find, in the dark, the best foothold for each. This disparity was not accidental. The system was designed to echo what served property, not what challenged it. The march was organized in segments. They progressed for a time, then froze, breath held, to listen. None of these stops had a name. No hour was noted. Yet, in the memory of those who survived, they would become fixed points, the woods where a branch creaked and where all believed they heard a voice, the ditch where one of them slipped, soaked to the knees, the clearing where, for an instant, the sky cleared, and they could, through the branches, distinguish a star that, without naming it, they knew pointed north. From time to time, the distant light of a white house could be discerned. There, Christmas was celebrated in the usual sense of the word: carols, candles, perhaps a fireplace fire. In some of these houses, people spoke indignantly of abolitionist agitations, of those Northerners who challenged the legitimacy of slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act was invoked as a victory, an additional guarantee that property would remain in its place. A few hundred yards away, in the thickets, the property in question moved forward, bent, silent. The legal bond that connected them to these houses stretched without anyone, for the moment, being officially informed. Harriet was aware that she carried, with this small column of men, more than the individual lives of her brothers. She also carried the accumulated experience of all her previous operations. She knew that a single failure could cause everything to collapse. A word spoken too loudly, a fire lit carelessly, misplaced trust in a human ally. In reports from suspicious owners, there was often talk of a gang that helped enslaved people flee, as if the danger came from a structured, hierarchical organization. The reality was more fragmented. A network of people who barely knew each other, who relied on passwords, on whispered recommendations, and each of whom could, at any moment, be arrested, intimidated, or turned. As they moved away from Poplar Neck, the brothers perhaps felt their fear change from. At first, it centered on the idea of being caught by a master, an overseer, a relative. The greater the distance, the more diffuse the threat became. That of an encounter with strangers, of a white face crossed too early, of a stranger asking too many questions. The law, which claimed to be the same everywhere, manifested, on the ground, in 1,000 attitudes. The zealous sheriff, the indifferent fame, the simple passers-by who, with an overly insistent gaze, could jeopardize the journey. It is probable that before the end of this first night, Harriet had arranged a first refuge, a barn, an abandoned cabin, a forest nook where they could for a few hours shelter from the cold. None of this appeared on official plans. In the archives, properties were defined by their boundaries, their owners, their copse. The patches of woods where fugitives huddled to tremble a little less were not mapped. They existed only in oral knowledge, transmitted by word of mouth, from generation to generation. In these pauses, the body reclaimed its rights. Bruised feet, cramped muscles, stomachs suddenly remembering they had not truly eaten for hours. Harriet perhaps had in her pockets a few pieces of bread, a little dried meat, paltry equivalents to the effort demanded. She had to calculate enough nourishment to sustain their strength, but not so much as to burden them. The logistics of the escape, absent from decrees and judgments, played out in these minuscule details. Meanwhile, administrative time and its course, indifferent. On the morning of December 25th, at the plantation, the absence would be noted. Initially, a delay would be assumed, a prolonged visit. The further the day advanced without the brothers reappearing, the more doubt would transmute into certainty. Someone would retrieve the passes, verify the dates, read the signatures. Then the master, or his representative, would take pen to record this fact in a personal ledger, a prelude to drafting a runaway notice. This gesture, simple for the one performing it, would result in the escape entering the domain of stolen property, transforming, in the eyes of the law, these men into objects to be recovered. But for now, in the heat of this first night of walking, the fugitives were still ahead of the ink. They moved faster than the words that would designate them. Every hour gained before the master sat at his desk was another chance to create distance, to teach a delay like Jacob Jackson's or one of Harriet's known stations. They might not phrase it thus, but they experienced in their flesh this discrepancy. running ahead of the text that sought to reclaim them. This chapter of the escape does not conclude with a spectacular event, a confrontation, a miracle. It ends with the idea of a passage. Somewhere, before dawn, the small column, guided by Harriet, crossed an invisible boundary, a road they dared not traverse, a stream making the end of a county, the last backward glance at a familiar steeple. In the archives, these bodies held no importance. One county succeeded another. For them, they were thresholds. Mainland law would continue to claim them far beyond that night. But the night, for its part, would have already done its work. It would have carried them a little further, towards lands where other hands, other papers, other silences would take over. When the first night drew to a close, the official dossier, for its part, remained unmoved. The three men were absent, but the master had not yet taken up his pen. The distance accumulated during these invisible hours offered Harriet and the brothers a fragile lead. From this moment, the escape was no longer played out solely on mainland territory, but on a broader geography, that of states, counties, administrative bodies, of laws that overlapped and sometimes contradicted each other. By crossing Delaware, then aiming for Pennsylvania, they entered the shifting space of what would later be called the Underground Railroad. On official maps, the route from Mainland's eastern shore to Delaware and then Pennsylvania was composed of roads, ferries, bridges, and villages. In the archives, one found lists of tolls, ferry schedules, innkeepers' licenses. None of this mentioned the nocturnal passages of men and women who, to avoid all scrutiny, bypassed official posts, crossed rivers at unplanned locations, slept in barns whose names appeared on no register. The network Harriet used was both real and absent from documents. It existed in the bodies of the fugitives, in the memory of guides, in the secret notes of abolitionists. But it left, at the very moment it operated, only fleeting traces. Delaware was an ambiguous territory, a slave state, yet also home to free blacks and abolitionists. It formed a dangerous transition zone. The law there authorized slaveholding. The Fugitive Slave Act was fully applicable. In the eyes of Maryland owners, fugitives who reached this soil had not crossed a true border. Yet, for those who walked, it was a psychological threshold, the tenuous feeling of having left the direct circle of surveillance of their former masters. In Delaware's registers, this stage would never be identified as such. Barely, at times, would one find mention of an intercepted Negro man or a wanted notice posted in a sheriff's office. It was in this uncertain space that the human escorts, known to history as the Underground Railroad, assumed their full importance. The term, already in use in the 1830s and 1840s, suggested an organized, almost mechanical system. The archives, when they referred to it, spoke of stations, of conductors, deliberately adopting the vocabulary of nascent railroads. But this network had neither rails nor official schedules. It was made up of men and women who, each in their place, agreed to violate the law to offer a roof, a meal, a direction to those who passed through. In Wilmington, Delaware, one name consistently appears in abolitionist documents and legal records: Thomas Garrett, Quaker, iron merchant. In the minutes of anti-slavery society meetings, in letters exchanged between activists, his address appeared as an almost obligatory waypoint. The authorities, moreover, were not mistaken. Garrett would be prosecuted, condemned to heavy fines for aiding fugitives. His acts recorded in trials where one read, in black and white, that he had knowingly and willfully assisted slaves to escape. These convictions, intended to intimidate him, did not prevent him from continuing. It is probable that Harriet's group, at some point in their journey, crossed paths with a man like Garrett or similar escorts. Quakers, Methodist pastors, free black families. The archives do not allow us to follow their exact footsteps. We do not have, for Christmas 1854, the equivalent of a journal where one would note, "Received today, a woman from Maryland and several men arrived during the night, famished, chilled to the bone." What we have are more general indications. Harriet later mentioned having worked with Quakers in Wilmington. Abolitionist records reported arrivals of groups in winter around the turn of the 1850s. Between these makes, we must construct a plausible itinerary. In a house like Thomas Gates, or in other committed households, the scene repeated itself, night after night. A door opened discreetly, figures entered, drenched, exhausted. Too many questions were not asked. Food was prepared, water was heated, dry clothes were found. The children of the house learned to avert their gaze, not to speak of these evening visitors at school, to remain silent when strangers came. These gestures, though so concrete, were elegantly encoded. Their existence is glimpsed through allusions in letters. We have received several travelers. The burden of these passages is heavy, but we cannot shirk it. The contrast with the official version is striking. In court, when a Guyette or another was prosecuted, the records described him as a disruptor, a troublemaker, a man who incited slaves to rebellion and violated federal laws. One read, "In the judge's glacial language, the condemnation of these acts as affronts to property." Nowhere appeared the details of daily life. The improvised beds, the meals eaten in silence, the fear that the door would be broken down in the middle of the night. Public archives covered these realities with a cloak of legal formulas. For Harriet and her brothers, crossing Delaware and accessing these relays represented a decisive transition. They moved from the status of isolated fugitives, hunted in the woods of Maryland, to that of passengers taken in charge by a network. This in no way diminished the danger, but altered the perception of time. In the first phase, every hour gained without being spotted was a victory. Henceforth, they could, for a few moments, rest knowing that others were watching, that eyes monitored the road, that ears listened for the sound of hooves. This respite, even brief, appeared in no report. It was read only in the late words of survivors who recalled those houses where, for the first time, they slept without being within immediate reach of the whip. Yet the group had to resume their journey. The destination was not Wilmington, not even Delaware, but Philadelphia, where a significant portion of Northern abolitionist efforts were concentrated. The city, in the archives, appeared as a nexus, correspondence of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, meeting spots, abolitionist newspapers like the Pennsylvania Freeman and other sheets. In the registers kept by William Still, fugitives arriving from Maryland were described, sometimes with details about their masters, their families, their character. It is unknown if Harriet's brothers left traces in this specific book. Even if their names do not appear there, their trajectory is part of the same movement of bodies converging on this city in search of support. Upon arrival in Philadelphia, the situation was paradoxical. Legally, the brothers were no safer than in Delaware. The Fugitive Slave Act was applied there, federal commissioners held sessions there, and slave catchers operated there. But politically and socially, the city offered a different breeding ground. Active black churches, associations, white and black activists who had learned to thwart, as much as possible, the maneuvers of Southern agents. In this context, Harriet could introduce her brothers to contacts, find temporary lodging for them, and organize the next stage of the journey. The dossier before us here thickens. It no longer merely juxtaposes documents from the South and oral accounts. It can draw upon the abolitionist archives of the North, where the voices of fugitives, though filtered, begin to emerge. Meeting minutes mention significant arrivals around Christmas, without always giving names. Activist newspapers published editorials denouncing the cruelty of post-holiday sales in slave states, inviting readers to contribute financially to support the newcomers. These texts do not necessarily cite Ben, Henry, and Robert, but they describe a reality that was theirs. The brothers, for their part, had to navigate this unknown city, where every street could be both refuge and trap. Slave catchers circulated there, armed with physical descriptions, with wanted notices sent by mail. Federal commissioners, whose names appeared in official directories, wielded disproportionate power. Upon simple presentation of an affidavit, they could order the rendition of a man to a Southern master, without a jury, without true defense. This mechanism, one of the central points of the Fugitive Slave Act, loomed over every step they took, even in the heat of black neighborhoods. In this stage, speech once again became an indispensable tool. Harriet had to explain to her brothers the dangers of the city, the necessity of remaining hidden, of changing their names, of not allowing themselves to be approached by strangers who might promise help in exchange for information. She also had to, paradoxically, persuade them to trust certain strangers. The white activists, the Quakers, the pastors who, though belonging to the same racial group as the masters, had placed themselves on the other side of the law. These nuances were not read in decrees. They were negotiated through glances, gestures, whispered recommendations. Thus, from the Eastern Shore to Philadelphia, via Delaware and Wilmington, the Christmas 1854 journey revealed the Underground Railroad in its most concrete and most elusive aspects. Concrete, because it rested on doors that opened, shared meals, guides who walked alongside the fugitives. Elusive, because official archives, focused on property, left these acts almost entirely in the shadows. To reconstruct this network, one must cross-reference fragments: a trial against a Guyot, a note in William Still's book, the memory of an old man interviewed decades late, who recalled having, one December evening, welcomed 3 trembling brothers into his home. At the conclusion of this chapter, the brothers had not yet arrived in a space where the law recognized them as free, but they had crossed several layers of territory, several circles of surveillance, thanks to this invisible web of people and places that challenged, through their actions, the legitimacy of an entire system. The sale, announced for just after Christmas in a Maryland county, was already beginning to clash with another reality, that of a county where some refused to let the notary's columns dictate, to the very end, the destiny of the bodies inscribed therein. In the dossier we hold open, Harriet and her brother's escape already seemed at this stage to have achieved its goal. They had left Maryland, they had traversed Delaware, they had passed through abolitionist relay to Philadelphia. Yet, if one followed the letter of the law, nothing was yet assured. Since 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act had extended the shadow of slavery far beyond the Mason-Dixon line. In the eyes of the federal government, Ben, Henry, and Robert remained fugitives, who could be arrested at any moment on the soil of the free states and returned to their masters. The border between North and South, so clear on some maps, brutally blurred in legal texts. In northern newspapers, debates multiplied. Some editorialists denounced the federal law as an insult to the sovereignty of the free states, an affront to Christian conscience. Others, on the contrary, insisted on the necessity of respecting the constitutional rights of Southern property owners, including that of pursuing their escaped slaves. Repots of fugitive tiles in Boston, New York, Philadelphia accumulated. Names, deceptions, decisions indeed by fidel commissionees who OD'd the indition of men and women to the South, despite the protests of neighbors, pastors, and abolitionists. In this legal tumult, one observation became undeniable: crossing the Mason-Dixon line was not enough. For Harriet, this reality was not abstract. She had seen, in recent years, fugitives turn from northern black communities, sometimes before the eyes of helpless neighbors. She had heard accounts of femmen wrongfully captured, lacking papes, delivered to masts who claimed to recognize them. The legal texts, fidel authorities, circulars, and posts displayed in northern cities constantly reminded that slavery, though concentrated in the South, was guaranteed by the anti-nation. In such a famewalk, Philadelphia was but a stopover. Foe he boths to truly escape the theat, anothe, moe distant, body had to be cost, that separating the United States from British territory. It was towards Canada West, what would late be called Ontario, that the gaze of fugitives and those who aided them now tuned. In letters exchanged between abolitionists, in pamphlets, in activist newspapers, this county was described as a refuge because slavery was abolished thee, and American authorities had no legal right to reclaim fugitives. Black communities had a lady foamed thee. In Windsor, Toronto Street, Cathanes, though out the 1840s and 1850s, Canadian Chuch Egistes censuses and civil ecods progressively encoded these avils, names, sometimes distorted, origins, mentioned as United States, Maryland, Virginia. While Harriet prepared this new stage, the South continued to claim he. In Maryland newspapers, advertisements offered Ewads, foe the capture, and a ton of Ben, Henny, Robert, described by thay complexion, statue, and any distinguishing marks. Sometimes an additional sum was promised for anyone providing information on the woman known as Harriet. Also, Minty o Aminta, accused of stealing Othie's property. The language remained true to itself. What Harriet considered asq was labelled theft and criminal conspiracy. Yet, as the articles we painted, the distance between these wads and the bodies they designated Jew. The ode to Canada was long and fragmented. From Philadelphia, one had to travel northeast, traverse the cities, avoid the commissioners, the slave catches. The itineraries varied. Some passed through New York, others through the interior of Pennsylvania and New York State, heading towards the Great Lakes region. Official maps, once again, showed railway lines, main roads, canals. Fugitives, however, used what was useful and bypassed the rest. They sometimes travelled by night, sometimes concealed in wagons, sometimes on foot, always with the awareness that every station was a place of danger as much as transition. The judicial archives of the North offered, indirectly, an echo of this circulation. One head of cases where masters from Maryland or Virginia asserted that their slaves had been led to Canada by abolitionists. Names already encountered reappeared. Quakers, pastors, sometimes Harriet herself, accused en masse in complaints describing her as a leader. But when the bodies actually reached the Canadian shore, these procedures lost their grip. The border this time was not merely symbolic. It marked the limit of American law's jurisdiction. The passage to Canada West often occurred via the Niagara region. On one side, the American city of Buffalo, on the other, the city of Fort Erie or other points on the Canadian shore. The river, the falls, the currents, all formed a spectacular landscape that few travelers described in their journals. For fugitives, it was not a tourist panorama, but a final barrier. Testimonies spoke of boats crossing by night, of bridges taken at dawn, of figures hurrying on the banks, ignoring the cold to focus on a single fact. On the other side, once foot was set, status changed. Canadian archives no longer classified these men as runaway slaves, but as new arrivals. In Street, Catherine's, a town in Canada West located near Niagara, the registers of Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian churches, as well as civil censuses, show, in the first half of the 1850s, names of black families who had come from the United States. Mentions of marriages, baptisms, and deaths are found there. The records sometimes indicate the place of origin: Maryland, Delaware, Virginia. These documents, with an administrative dryness comparable to that of the Maryland registers, nevertheless bore an inverse significance. In the South, the registration fixed a person in the status of a slave. It fixed them within a community of free people. Harriet Tubman herself settled, for a time, in Street, Catherine's. which became a fallback base between her journeys south. Local archives evoke the presence of a Miss Tubman, active in the black community, attending church, living modestly. For her, it was not a definitive refuge, but a space from which she could organize other escapes. For her brothers, however, Canada represented the end of the journey initiated at Christmas 1854. Once this threshold was crossed, the question was no longer how to escape capture, but how to live here, far from all we have known. Freedom, here, came at a price that laws did not measure. Legally, Ben, Henry, and Robert had won. No American wanted notice could legitimately reach them anymore. No reward, however high, could authorize a slave catcher to arrest them on British Crown soil. Parliamentary debates, treaties, and judges' opinions had delineated this protection. But these same texts said nothing of the cost of knowing that one could no longer, without danger, return to the lands of the eastern shore, visit the cabin of one's childhood, embrace one's aging mother. In the years that followed, Canadian censuses noted the stable presence of these communities from the south. One saw men who were property become laborers, farmers, carpenters. One saw women registered as domestics, then as wives, mothers, sometimes owners of small homes. Church records recorded baptisms of children born free, whose birth certificates mentioned no servile condition. The archives, here, recorded a new normality. Yet, in the memories of those concerned, nothing was normal. Every winter, every holiday, every reading of certain biblical passages could recall the starting point. A Christmas night, papers signed by a master, a sale narrowly avoided. The moral tension shifted. In the United States, it centered on the fear of capture, the immediate threat of legal violence. In Canada, it became more diffuse, more interior. It took the form of an invisible exile. Fugitives had to learn to build a life where they had not chosen to live, with a language sometimes different, new customs, a harsh climate. They also had to manage the news that continued to arrive from the south. A parent dead, a sister sold, a brother left behind. Every letter, every visit from a new fugitive brought its share of memories, guilt, regrets. For Haiti, who continued to circulate between Canada West and the northern states, this dual horizon became permanent. She knew that, for those she had helped each Street Catherines or other communities, the price of safety was the almost total impossibility of legally revisiting the places where their loved ones still remained. She also knew that, as long as the slave system endured, no individual victory was complete. The laws that guaranteed freedom in Canada did not ease those which, at the same moment, in the United States, continued to protect the internal slave trade, post-Christmas sales, and punishments. In this chapter of the dossier, Canada West appears neither as a paradise nor as a mere final backdrop. It is a different legal space, offering real protection against the American slave machine, but imposing, in exchange, the weight of profound uprooting. Canadian church registers, censuses, and notarial deeds show us fugitives settled, married, integrated into new communities. The voices, when listened to though direct testimonies, add a nuance. The freedom obtained does not ease the anguish of nights of escape, nor the faces of those who did not cross the river. By temporarily closing this Canadian section, we grasp the measure of what choosing eternal exile meant for Ben, Henry, and Robert. This choice was not formulated in the abstract terms of a legal treaty, but by walking, by successively crossing visible and invisible borders, to the point where only Canadian papers would recognize them as free men. The fear of being recaptured exceeded. In its place, another form of vertigo settled, that of an entire life to be lived far from the soil where one was born, with, as the only lasting link to that past, a dossier made up of disparate documents and memories that no one, at the time, had deemed worth writing down. When we attempt, today, To reconstruct the Christmas night of 1854, we no longer possess the walking bodies nor the whispering voices. We are left with traces. They are not gathered in a single dossier, but dispersed. Here, a line in a biography. There, a paragraph in a local study. Elsewhere, a popular article, a marginal archive note. To understand what remains of that Christmas of escape, one must accept to move from one type of document to another, gauging each time what the paper reveals, and what it still leaves in shadow. In the official archives of Maryland, the name of Benjamin Ross, Harriet's father, appears in a biographical notice preserved by the Maryland State Archives. It mentions his life as an enslaved man, then, later, as a free man settled in Poplar Neck, the very place where the Christmas 1854 episode would unfold. It also briefly mentions his daughter's flight after their master's death in 1849, but the night Harriet returned for her brothers is not described in detail. It is absorbed into a broader narrative, that of the Ross family, their movements, their partial emancipations. Major biographical syntheses on Harriet Tubman often follow the same logic. They recount that after her own flight, she carried out approximately 13 missions, enabling some 60 enslaved people to gain freedom. They cite her courage, her nickname Moses of her people, her role during the Civil War. In this overall picture, Christmas 1854 sometimes appears as one example among others. A brief sentence stating that, at Christmas, she returned to Maryland to free her 3 brothers. This is the case, for instance, in notices aimed at the general public, which speak of the rescue from Poplar Neck in a few lines, without dwelling on the sale calendar or the rumor that triggered the operation. Other sources, more focused, delve deeper into this precise moment. Historical popular articles, written in the 21st century, recount in detail what researchers have been able to reconstruct. The news of a sale planned immediately after the holidays, the coded letter sent to Jacob Jackson, the rendezvous at Poplar Neck, the Christmas escape. Some explicitly cite the subverted biblical message, when the good old ship of Zion comes along, transmitted to warn the brothers and prepare them for departure. But these accounts, too, remain peripheral. They are published on websites dedicated to local history, thematic walks, pedagogy, not in grand national histories of slavery. This discrepancy is clearly evident when comparing how institutions speak of Harriet. Museums and foundations present her journey by emphasizing her general role, a figure of the Underground Railroad, an abolitionist, militant, a nurse, a spy during the war, a symbol of courage. When Christmas 1854 is mentioned, for example, in notices explaining that on Christmas Day 1854, Tubman led the 3 brothers to freedom, it is summarized to a date and a place: Poplar Neck, Eastern Shore, heading to Canada. The details of the internal plantation calendar, the sale announcements, Christmas permissions, the pauses in the marshes, most often remain outside the frame. Alongside these biographies and notices, another type of trace has emerged in recent decades: commemorations. On Maryland's Eastern Shore, a tourist and historical route has been created, the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Byway. It follows, for over 200 kilometers, roads, marshes, hamlets, and sites linked to her life and operations. This byway is presented as a route to be traveled by car, bicycle, or on foot, punctuated by explanatory panels, interpretation centers, and landscapes that remain close to those of the 19th century. In this context, the night of Christmas 1854 has found its place. Local associations and the state park dedicated to Harriet Tubman now organize, every Christmas Eve, commemorative walks on a portion of the path that Harriet and the brothers are believed to have taken. Conferences are offered, readings of passages from books devoted to this escape, moments of reflection. The announcements for these events, published on the byway or museum websites, speak of a Christmas Eve escape, of a walk on the path of escape, inviting participants to visualize the scene. A freezing night, men and women hidden in a cornfield or a wood, awaiting the signal to depart. The social media channels of cultural institutions also, almost every year, mark this date as a milestone. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, for example, reminds us that on Christmas Eve 1854, Harriet Tubman returned to the Eastern Shore to liberate her brothers Ben, Henry, and Robert. Educational blogs encourage families to talk about this night with their children, to leave cookies for Harriet Tubman rather than for lighter figures of Christmas folklore. In these contemporary publications, the night of escape becomes a tool of transmission, a counter-narrative of Christmas centered not on the lights of palaces, but on courage and solidarity in the darkness. In Canada West, commemorations take another form. In Street Catharines, where Harriet lived and where many fugitives found refuge, the Salem Chapel British Methodist Episcopal Church is now a national historic site. Studies and articles dedicated to this church recall that it was a center of the local black community, frequented by Harriet and other formerly enslaved people who became free in Canada. Guided tours are offered there, and panels explain the city's role as a terminus of the Underground Railroad. Some texts mention, among the episodes that led refugees here, the famous escape of Christmas 1854. Thus, the event which, for Harriet's family, constituted a turning point, the difference between being sold after Christmas or crossing the Canadian border, is today inscribed in a landscape of plaques, brochures, commemorative walks, and online posts. It has become a site of memory in the material sense of the term, a place where one can walk, listen, read, and try to imagine the experience of those who came before. Yet, if one returns to the grand syntheses of American slavery, to history textbooks, to reference works, the contrast is stark. Where local commemorations dedicate an entire program to this night, national histories sometimes grant it a sentence, sometimes nothing at all. This discrepancy is not unique to this single night. It stems from the way official versions of the past are constructed. Grand histories prioritize numbers, the number of fugitives, the number of missions, the dates of laws, the battles of the Civil War, and figures that have become symbols. Harriet Tubman, in these narratives, embodies resistance to slavery as a whole. But this symbolic elevation comes at a cost. It flattens the plurality of moments, reducing episodes like Christmas 1854 to interchangeable examples. What was, for Ben, Henry, Robert, Rit, and Harriet, a night of total upheaval, becomes one more entry in the list of escapes attributed to her. Examining the dossiers, however, one finds the singular density of this episode. The threat of the post-holiday sale attested in the advertisements and practices of the time. The coded letter that was not preserved, but whose text is recounted in narratives. The wanted notices, which in hindsight reported the escape. The Canadian censuses where, a few years later, men bearing the same first names reappear, now recorded as free. Between these fragments, a certain number of silences must be accepted. The Maryland State Archives dossier does not explain what Rit felt seeing her sons leave. The register of a street. Catherine's church says nothing of the nightmares that, perhaps, awakened them every subsequent Christmas. The moral tension here arises from this disproportion. On one side, for a family, Christmas 1854 was an abyss, the decision to abandon everything, the walk, the exile, the impossibility of turning back. On the other, for collective memory, the event remains marginal, fragile, dependent on local initiatives, commemorative marches, educational projects. If, tomorrow, some of these institutions were to disappear, a part of the acts of transmission, the Christmas Eve walk, the public reading of escape narratives would vanish in turn, leaving behind only a few broken links on archived sites. By temporarily closing this dossier on traces, silences, and commemorations, we can measure what is at stake each Christmas when we choose to recall or not, that night. To remember Christmas 1854 is not only to honor the heroic figure of Harriet Tubman, it is to restore to a date, to a calendar, to a specific family, the place that grand natives often deny it. It is to recognize that, behind the phrase "she saved approximately 60 people," there are particular Christmases, aborted sales, subverted permissions, mothers clasping their sons in a dark cabin, knowing that, in the morning, their names would no longer be read in the same column of the registers. On the first page of our dossier, there was a date, almost drowned in other writings, December 24, 1854. At the time, for the Maryland administrations, it was merely a mark in a year-end calendar, a milestone before the realization of an inheritance, a simple holiday eve. For the masters, it was an evening of set tables, raised glasses, excited prayers. For others, in the cabins by the marshes, it was the last night before the sale. For Harriet, her brothers, and their mother, it was the thin footbridge between being aligned in a column of assets and tumbling into the uncertain category of fugitives. Closing this dossier, we can revisit, one by one, the pieces spread before us. First, there are the laws. Those of Maryland, which set the conditions of slavery, organized sales, enumerated the penalties for fugitives. Then the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, with its numbered articles, its lengthy sentences, its cold certainty of being able to reclaim a fleeing body hundreds of miles from its birthplace. The language there is precise, technical, devoid of hesitation. Nowhere does it admit that these words would cleave Christmas in two, a celebration in the parlors, a menace in the cabins. Beside them, we have placed the newspaper fragments. In the columns of the local press, insets announce sales immediately after the holidays. Others report, a few days later, the flight of certain enslaved people who took advantage of Christmas permissions to escape. On the same sheet, one can read a meditation on the Nativity, an exhortation to Christian charity, and a notice offering a reward for the return of these subjects. The paper is not troubled by this contradiction. It holds together, without trembling, the celebration of a child born in a stable and the pricing of those kept in cabins. We also have, in our dossier, narratives and memories, sometimes collected decades later. Biographies of Harriet Tubman relate phrases attributed to her, images she reportedly used. The hand gazed at with astonishment upon arrival in free territory, the faith in a providence that indicated the moment to depart, the memory of her brothers snatched from the Christmas sale. Other testimonies from former enslaved people or their descendants speak of ambiguous Christmases where a little meat and fabric were received, while fearing being designated for the next sale. These voices each us though filters, translations, omissions. They do not fill the blanks in the archives, but they illuminate them from another angle. On another pile, we have placed the maps, those of the eastern shore, with its marshes, its rivers, its scattered farms, those of Delaware, Pennsylvania, New York State, the Niagara region, those of Canada West, where villages like Street, Catherine suddenly appear as terminals of routes that, on paper, do not exist. These official maps do not bear the mention escape route, refuge, safe relay. It is Harriet's mental maps, the cross-referenced accounts of fugitives, the itineraries of the Underground Railroad, that restore to these places their secret meaning. Christmas 1854 is no longer merely a point in time. It becomes a nexus in this entanglement of spaces. And then there are the gaps, the burned pages, the lost registers, the letters that were never kept. The coded letter sent to Jacob Jackson, for example, we do not possess it. We know it only through reported quotations, paraphrases, the exact dialogues between Harriet and her brothers, between Rit and her sons, between Harriet and those who helped her on the road, are nowhere to be found. The archives give us clues, a sales notice, a mention of fugitives, an inscription in a Canadian register, but they remain silent on what these men and women felt upon hearing, one December evening, that there would be a sale after the holidays. This silence is not merely a technical accident due to fires, to material losses. It is also the product of a choice, that of not deeming worthy of record what transpired in the cabins, on the roads, in the bodies of those who endured the law rather than signing it. Christmas 1854, viewed from the perspective of the authorities, is merely an incident in the management of an estate, a delay in a succession. Viewed from the perspective of Harriet, Ben, Henry, Robert, Rit, it is an irreversible factor. Udossi attempts to partially re-establish this divergence of perspective. Stepping out of the archives, we find ourselves faced with another question. What do we do today with such a night? When our societies speak of Christmas, which narratives do we privilege? The images that circulate illuminated storefronts, family reunions, serene, snowy landscapes leave little room for these Christmases of flight, separation, forced decision. In churches, the story of a couple who found no room and a child laid in a manger is still read. More rarely, it is recalled that, late in the same narrative, a family had to flee to Egypt to escape the violence of a power. The Christmases of the enslaved, the Christmases of sales and exiles, most often remain out of view. Certainly, places like the Eastern Shore, street Catherines, museums, byways, commemorative marches, attempt to reinscribe this night of 1854 into our memory. Guides tell visitors how Harriet took advantage of Christmas permissions to thwart a sale, how families today walk these roads to remember. Teachers evoke, in class, another Christmas, made of cold and fear, not ribbons. But these efforts remain localized, fragile, dependent on budgets, trends, individual wills. They could, one day, be interrupted. The grand media images of Christmas, however, continue to follow their course. To return to the date of December 24, 1854, as a symbol, is to accept introducing a fissure into this smooth decor. It is to remember that calendars are not neutral, that the same days can signify rest for some, upheaval for others. It is to look at a decorated fir tree and wonder, perhaps for a second, how many times in history decisions of sale, expulsion, war, or roundup were signed just after the holidays, taking advantage of this moment when guards were lowered. It is to hear a Christmas carol and superimpose upon it, without confusing them, the footsteps of men and women who advanced into the night so as not to be sold on the morrow. In closing this dossier, we cannot restore to Harriet, to her brothers, to their mother, the entirety of what the archives have stolen from them. We cannot precisely rehear their voices, nor feel what they felt seeing, one morning, the snow or Canadian mud beneath their feet, far from the Maryland marshes. We can only recognize that their Christmas was stolen, torn from the logic of holidays to become an operation of survival, then erased from grand narratives to be but one date among others in the list of escapes. The only thing still offered to us is the responsibility for what we do with this knowledge. In our own calendars of holidays and consumption, we can choose to leave these Christmases of escape in the shadows, like footnotes, or to let them modify, at least slightly, the way we speak of the season. At the end of this narrative, the narrator has no triumphant conclusion to offer, no simple moral to deliver. He merely poses, in the silence where the documents cease, a question that no longer belongs to him. Now that we know these weeks, here and elsewhere, stolen Christmases, stolen memories, what will each of us do with that night of 1854 when, upon our own walls, the date of December 24 returns?